morning. Mr. Dapo, CEO of the Financial Services Commission. Mrs. Siwa Zubal, Second Deputy Governor of the Bank of Mauritius. Mr. Manjaman, CEO of Mauritius Finance. Mrs. Charlène Blanche, Senior Manager, Financial Services Commission. Friends, colleagues, distinguished guests. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the second Knowledge Initiative of Bowmans. And I'm even more excited because it is one of the first in-person events after a very long time. All protocols, including the safety protocols, are being observed. I would like to thank each one of you, and especially our guest speakers, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend this workshop called at quite short order. Just a few words on who we are. Some of you know us or have heard of us by now. Bowmans is a Pan-African law firm with offices in South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Zambia, and since 2019 we have a Mauritius office. Bowmans has made its motto and tagline the value of knowing. And by this we mean that we have made it our mission to harness knowledge and use our expertise to unlock legal complexities for our clients. We live on a continent of incredible diversity and constant transformation, where knowledge, whether it be in law, in our markets, in terms of trends, is the true power. We firmly believe that by working together collaboratively as a group, by combining legal, business and market experience, by transforming legal complexity into simplicity, and by delivering this knowledge in a streamlined fashion, we as a collective become truly empowered to unlock value and all the potential that this continent has to offer. It is within this spirit that we organize this workshop today on the theme of post-FATF Grey Listing, what is next for Mauritius? The Grey List, or the Blacklist for those who look at it from a European Union perspective, has been haunting our shores since 2020. At first, it was a bit of a shock. There was a feeling of denial. Was this really happening to us, Mauritius, who has always prided itself to be amongst the early adopters of all international norms, all international standards, diligently signing up conventions and multilateral agreements, and participating very keenly and cooperating with other nations in implementing international best practice. How could this be happening? Now, we came to terms that this was very real. It was not a threat, it was actually happening. We then thought, maybe it's something we can fix quite quickly. Because we are very good in terms of our international relations in discussing, lobbying, dialogue. And we have always kept an open line with bigger nations, stronger nations. Couldn't we negotiate a suspension or a cure period? We were quickly disillusioned because our opponents in this struggle were resolute. They said that enough was enough. Once the shining beacon of best practices, Mauritius had become a bit of a barrier amongst nations, without us fully realizing how and when it had happened. Following this, there was a period of protest. Why was Mauritius being unduly singled out, while others were doing a lot less and getting away with it? Especially in a period where the pandemic made things very difficult. It was seen as unfair there were legal and political strategies, countermeasures, but these were quickly abandoned. Eventually, there was acceptance. We realized that the only way out was to roll up our sleeves and collectively work towards a common goal. I take this opportunity here to congratulate the work done by the business community, the respective professions and the government and the regulators, whose concerted efforts and relentless efforts managed to get us to safe shores. Now, as we exit, we take a moment. We take stock of the impact so that we can better measure what we need to rebuild. During the past 20 months or so, we have witnessed our funds industry, our global business, our banking system steady is slow, but steady corrosion. New funds and holdcos were not being set up, or very scarcely so. DFIs, development finance institutions, to whom we owe the success of our funds industry, and the fund managers were looking at alternative jurisdictions or re-domiciling. Payments coming in and out of Mauritius banks and financial institutions were being scrutinized by foreign counterparties. Enhanced due diligence meant that transactions were being greatly delayed, thus lessening our effectiveness as a jurisdiction to do business with. In many instances, I came across clients who had to route their clients to an alternative bank, an alternative jurisdiction, in order to meet their obligations. This is now hopefully behind us. But undoubtedly through this process, there are many lessons that have been learned. Yet, there are questions that remain. How long will it take for the stigma to go away? It's not something that will magically disappear as if the whole thing never happened. Never will we be able to say never on a blacklist. Certainly it will take time, but also continued concerted efforts by the policymakers and by the business community to make good on our promise to be an international financial center of international good repute that can bring value to our client. Another question: what are we left with after this process? What is the legacy coming out in terms of regulation? Already pre-2020, I think some of my colleagues who know we faced a number of disgruntled investors who would say that our AML was already quite onerous, that they have dealt with many jurisdictions across the world. They were multinational investors, but yet they haven't had the scrutiny they have from Mauritius administrators or from Mauritius banks. Now that this framework has been reinforced, can we still be competitive as a jurisdiction and attract new business while abiding by the new normal of KYC requirements? These, ladies and gentlemen, are some of the questions that our learned panelists will address today. We have the great honor to welcome amongst us the second Deputy of the Governor of Mauritius and the Chief Executive of the Financial Services Commission, pre-eminent regulators of the banking and the non-banking financial sector, who will give perspectives from the regulator on the impact of the Grey List on the banking and non-banking sector, respectively. We have the CEO of Mauritius Finance, who will give insight on how the industry has dealt with the challenges of the Grey List and now of the reinforced AML framework. Mrs. Charlene Louis-Blanche, Senior Manager of the FSC, will then talk to us on the expectations of the regulator in the post-Grey List framework. We will also hear from our experts. Our partner Shianee from Bowmans Mauritius leads the the compliance practice, and she will be sharing her thoughts on what we have achieved thus far and what is the future looking like in terms of AML compliance. Last but not least, our partner Matthew Burgess, who travelled from our South Africa office for this workshop, will be doing a comparison between the South African and the Mauritian compliance framework and sharing his thoughts on our compliance region. This will be followed by a Q&A session, but can I just emphasize that we would welcome any thoughts and questions and comments after our speakers have delivered their address, so that this can be an interactive session. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Mr. Thakur, CEO of Regulator.
Thank you. Mr. Sarvan Singh Parmeshwar, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Financial Services and Good Governance, and also board member of the Financial Services Commission. Siwaj Gopal, Second Deputy Governor of the Bank of Mauritius. Mr. Fazil Hossenkhan, Managing Partner, Bowmans Mauritius. Partners of Bowmans Mauritius. Mr. Machi Purchase, Partner, Bowmans South Africa. Mr. Samajam, CEO of Mauritius Finance, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Very good morning to all of you and welcome to this compliance workshop. It's been held at the initiative of Bowmans. Over the past 1.5 years, we have been focusing our attention and energy on getting out of the FATF Grey List. But now that we are out, it is opportune to think on the aftermath of the grey or blacklisting. And therefore I commend Bowmans Law for this initiative, and also thank Bowmans Law for giving me this opportunity to address this audience today. Ladies and gentlemen, our removal from the Grey List comes after assiduous work and strategies put in place by all supervisory bodies in Mauritius. I will take this opportunity to thank government for its unwavering support throughout, and I also extend my appreciation to all our stakeholders within the financial services sector and the banking sector who worked relentlessly during 1.5 years for this outcome. It was a demonstration of unity. And following our exit from the FATF Grey List, now we are awaiting an exit from the European Commission list of high-risk third countries, also called the EU blacklist. Ladies and gentlemen, to properly formulate our post-FATF Grey List strategy, it is very important that we recall what were the strategic deficiencies and what we needed to do and what we will need to continue to do. No doubt that the strategic deficiencies that needed to be addressed were a tall order for any institution or jurisdiction. Nevertheless, government made a high-level political commitment to work with the FATF and the SAMLAC to strengthen the effectiveness of its AML safety regime and strongly committed to complete the action plan. Today, we completed the action plan ahead of the timeline. And at the level of the FSC, we had to undertake a number of high-level initiatives. To name a few, we had to carry out our risk-based supervision, which was actually the basis of everything, carry out outreach sessions, issue guidelines, practice notes and publications which were clear and understandable to our stakeholders, ensure that the post-risk-based supervision we had appropriate enforcement actions taken in case of breaches, and to support all these we had also to ensure that our human resources were adequate to undertake this endeavor. Ladies and gentlemen, with respect to the risk-based supervision framework, the FSC completed its first risk-based supervisory cycle 2021 which starts from our cycle, which starts from March and ends in February, and we completed 364 on-site inspections and conducted, and despite the pandemic, we were on track. And this year, which is our second year of supervisory cycle, we have a further 382 on-site inspections to carry out, and we are almost two-thirds in this cycle, and we are on track this year. The FSC also ensured that there was a risk-based supervisory management put in place to address lower risk effectively, such as through desk-based reviews and thematic questionnaires. As such, for the first RBS cycle, a total of 407 off-site policy reviews were completed, and we have, for the second cycle, 712 planned. Here also, I must say, we are on track. Furthermore, as part of the FSC's initiative to continue assisting financial institutions in their AML-CFT obligations, the FSC is committed to conduct sustainable outreach activities. For the first RBS cycle, the FSC conducted 22 outreach awareness sessions to licensees and continues to educate and guide its licensees on both MLTF risks and MLTF obligations. Moreover, Mauritius updated its practice notes on qualified trustees, which illustrates MLTF risk associated with lack of BO information. The FSC also conducted, since 2020, 7 outreach sessions with qualified trustees as part of its objectives to continue to strengthen the understanding of the inherent vulnerabilities of legal arrangements. Ladies and gentlemen, it is equally important to point out that the FSC published and updated its AML-CFT handbook, published the enforcement manual, the administrative penalties regulatory framework, and the settlement framework during the course of 2020. These frameworks and protocols, which serve as reference tools for the regulated community, are in line with AML-CFT international norms. The FSC also updated and published a guidance on proliferation financing in line with the national guidelines on 29 August 2020. And at September 2021, the FSC has conducted 19 outreach sessions covering targeted financial sanctions and proliferation financing to educate licensees on their AML-CFT obligations. And in terms of enforcement actions, ladies and gentlemen, the FSC applies dissuasive and proportionate sanctions to its licensees for AML-CFT breaches. In this regard, not all instances of non-compliance are subject to disciplinary sanctions by the FSC. Where remedial action plans are not applicable, and in cases of serious or repeated non-compliance, these matters are referred to the enforcement for appropriate actions. Over the past cycle, a total of 108 cases were referred to for enforcement actions, which resulted in show cause letters issued, sanctions, as well as monetary penalties imposed. And to support these action items over the past year, a total of 66 staff were recruited to conduct off-site and on-site inspections and related supervisory functions in a sustained manner. FSC also ensured continuous training of all its staff through national, international, or in-house training programs to develop and maintain proficiency and to keep abreast of international best practices. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is only after all the collective effort mentioned earlier that these action plans successfully executed that we have been able to exit the FATF Grey List. Now we have enough congratulated ourselves, and we certainly cannot sit back. and expect that businesses will run towards us. The rebuilding of our jurisdiction starts now, and once again, we will need all the stakeholders on board and looking in the same direction. We will need the best strategies in place and assessment of causes and effects to be able to reap the best possible returns for, if I could say, the rebirth of our jurisdiction. The good news is that work has already started. Ladies and gentlemen, let me reconnect on what we have to do. One of the requirements of FATF is sustainability of the process. Sustainability as per FATF means that we need to have a process to continue doing what we have been assessed upon by FATF. At the level of the FSC, I can assure you that on-site inspections will continue. We are already, as I mentioned, 2/3 through our second cycle of inspections, and next year there will certainly be another round and henceforth. This is our goal on sustainability that will continue. Our outreach programs will also continue to ensure that our licensees are kept abreast with developments and be mindful of our targeted approach to supervision. There will be another round of risk-based assessment questionnaire next year to gauge the level of vulnerabilities posed by our licensees and their corresponding level of controls. Our publications will be sustained to assist the sector in better understanding AML safety requirements and at the same time enhancing the ease of doing business. And finally, sanctions where applicable will also continue. For what we went through over the past months and the consequences, whether they were direct or indirect, that we felt, I'm sure that everybody will agree with me that we certainly do not wish to experience such a repeat ever again. For this, I'm relying on all stakeholders to be the gatekeepers of our financial center and to ensure that we fly high our proud flag of an FATF compliant jurisdiction. Believe me, the benefits that we all will be reaping will be enormous. Ladies and gentlemen, the strategy going forward requires collaboration with the industry. Since 2020, the FSC has been working closely with the industry associations in view to positioning our jurisdiction on top of investors' lists. The aim was always to be ready when we would be exiting the listing in due course. The time has now arrived and we can say that a lot has already been completed. For example, the Special Purpose Fund, Real Estate Investment Trust, crowdfunding, family offices, peer-to-peer lending, just to name a few. We expect that such diversification of our product base, coupled with our exit from the Grey List, will bring new impetus to the Mauritius IFC. Furthermore, we have put in place, at the level of the FSC, a series of working groups under the FSC Mauritius Finance quarterly meetings, which are mandated to assess the different sectors under the purview of the FSC and to come up with the best strategies and products to place our jurisdiction on the forefront of the investors' choices. You will note also that during the National Budget Speech 2021 and 2022, it is already mentioned the strategic directions that the financial industry needs to take, especially in fintech and fund sectors. Our working groups are presently looking into the implementation of these measures, and we will have more developments to communicate to you in the running towards the end of this year. Additionally, we have recently introduced licenses and technical frameworks that reflect our ambition to be a competitive force in Africa and beyond. Furthering in this direction, and in an increasingly connected world, global trends and perspectives on money laundering and terrorism financing will affect our fight against financial crime. The FSC is committed to applying the necessary human and technological resources to protect the reputation of our jurisdiction and to demonstrate our effectiveness in addressing this global issue. The convergence of technology and financial services has already begun, and it is necessary for us to ensure that we firstly harness on the added capabilities offered by technology. Secondly, develop a thorough understanding of the innovative business models that are emerging, and thirdly, leverage on fintech to explore new financial business activities. It is with this in mind that we came up with the FSC One platform, and which is an all-in-one encompassing technology advancement to simplify the licensing process and to enhance the post-licensing experience without foregoing any safeguards. I am convinced that the FSC One platform will ease our transition into the next stage of our sophistication. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, I wish to highlight that risk typologies will continue to evolve and money laundering techniques will become increasingly sophisticated. Globally, regulations and safeguards against money laundering and terrorism financing will always try to keep pace. Here on Mauritius, we will foster for growth and innovation, supported by our robust AML CFT framework. We at the FSC will continue on our AML CFT agenda and will ensure that the repute of our jurisdiction is maintained at all times. We will continue on our actions to protect the integrity of our financial system, including the global business sector. With these words, I wish you a successful workshop and fruitful deliberations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Tako, for your enlightening insights. Mr. Sarati Promesa, Permanent Secretary and Board Member of the FSC. Mr. Tako, CEO of the Financial Services Commission. Mrs. Shianee Calcutteea, Second Deputy Governor of the Bank of Mauritius. Mr. Samatraman, CEO of the Mauritius Finance. Mrs. Charlotte Luc-March, Senior Manager of the FSC. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for taking valuable time off your busy schedules to attend this workshop. The delisting of Mauritius off the FATF Grey List is indeed a great step in restoring the reputation of the island as a credible and robust international financial center. I would like to take this opportunity to thank each and every member of the community for the incredible work in getting us off the Grey List in such a record time. It is undeniable that the Grey List has had an impact on the industry. A lot of changes and amendments were brought, not only to our legislative framework, but also to our modus operandi. Whilst we welcome these changes which have improved our AML and CFT framework and made us at par with international financial centers, we are at the same time conscious of the added layer of the administrative burden and responsibility that those changes entail for the financial services industry. Coupled with the adoption of the BEPS principles, amendments to certain DTAs to which we are a party, the landscape of the global business sector is changing. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to reinvent ourselves. Mauritius has come a long way indeed, but the demands of the market are evolving. We should look at the diversification of this industry, both in terms of geographical space and the products being offered. Competition is fierce out there, but we can still take advantage of the strategic position of Mauritius for investments across the African continent. Mauritius remains one of the favorite jurisdictions for Africa-centric investments. Its geographic location, political stability, pool of highly skilled labor force, and dedicated service providers who are both fluent in French and English are all assets in making Mauritius an attractive gateway to Africa. There is more and more interest, and investments in Africa from Mauritius is gaining traction. Well, it is based on this confidence that Bowmans, a pan-African network of law firms, has opened its doors in Mauritius. We would not have been here otherwise today. There is potential and opportunities in further developing and growing this market. Ladies and gentlemen, the blueprint of the Mauritius IFC of 2030 identified 3 core pillars as a future of IFC, being cross-border investments, cross-border corporate banking, and private banking and wealth management. Additional opportunities were also identified in international capital markets, captive insurance in Africa, cross-border asset management, and Africa fintechs. We should also be looking at developing and expertise in servicing sectors such as real estate, infrastructure, mining, and private equity. In order to remain competitive, we should also look at broadening our range of products being offered. In that respect, Mauritius has already started its course of modernization and diversification. We note with interest that several measures have been announced in the last 2 budgets, including the introduction of a variable capital company, the special purpose acquisition companies, and a regulatory framework for virtual assets. Speaking of variable capital companies, this has gained quite some popularity within our competing jurisdictions, such as Singapore. This vehicle has predominantly been used for open-ended and closed-ended funds and private equity business. The VCC would be an attractive product to make to market as it provides flexibility in terms of the capital of the fund, thereby having a competitive edge over other vehicles. With the amendments brought to the Securities Act, the capital market is also undergoing some major changes and being diversified. One such example is the launching of Afrinex Limited, which is the first Pan-African trading platform. In our opinion, innovation and proactiveness remain the key elements to further develop the sector. Ladies and gentlemen, whilst we celebrate exiting the Grey List, we should also be mindful of the steps to take to avoid a reshoot. With all the amendments that have been made to the AML and CFT framework, much emphasis is laid on ensuring that we have a robust system in place to avoid any dubious companies or investments falling through these cracks. I would let our second guest from the FSC, Mr. Shianee, explain in more detail of the expectations of the regulator. But it is precisely with this in mind that we have moved from a tick-the-box approach to a risk-based approach. As lawyers, from our experience in helping institutions setting up their compliance framework, we know that there's still some work to be done in ensuring that businesses really embrace the compliance culture and understand its importance for the continued thriving of this sector. The compliance function within an organization should not be regarded as a mandatory ticking the box exercise, but as a value add. Firstly, to the organization itself, and also to the clients that the institution services or wishes to service. Increasingly, clients are looking to do business with highly compliant institutions. The legislation now requires reporting institutions to conduct an independent compliance audit. This exercise should be given its due importance. It not only allows to identify weak areas within the institution, exposing the financial and reputational risk, but also provides a marketing opportunity to the organizations. Through the report which is submitted to them at the end of this exercise, service providers can market their organizations to prospective clients which consider adherence to international standards of AML and CFT as key criteria in their decision-making process. It is therefore important that robust systems and procedures are put in place by the authorities to ensure that there is continued adherence to the set frameworks by the players in the financial services industry. Implementing the AML and CFT framework for an organization is a vital process which requires a good understanding of a business in order to put in place the appropriate framework and policies. Therefore, partnering with a service provider having the right level of expertise is recommended. But the obligation does not stop here. Organizations should also ensure that there are mechanisms in place which allow for an efficient ongoing monitoring of their client files and regular updates against amendments to laws or sanctions lists. Capacity building of the human capital should also be one of the tools in helping us strengthen our financial services sector. Care should be taken that training programs are tailored to the needs and requirements of the industry. Ladies and gentlemen, we are the proud players in an industry which is dynamic and is currently being called upon to be revamped. Let us all commit to ensure that we uphold to the highest standards and work towards building a robust and sound international financial center. On that note, I would like to welcome Mrs. Global for address.
Mr. Hennessy Park, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Financial Services and Good Governance, Mr. Shianee, CEO of the Financial Services Commission, Mr. Fazil Hossenkhan, the Managing Partner of Bowmans Mauritius, Partners of Bowmans Mauritius, Mr. Matthew Purchase, Partner of Bowmans South Africa, Mr. Samantruman, CEO, Mauritius Finance, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you. Indeed, I would like to join hands with Mr. Dako here present, the CEO of the FSC, in commending Bowmans for arranging this workshop. This workshop comes at an opportune time after Mauritius exits from the FATF Grey List. Today, I will start by sharing the experience of the central bank and the banking community since the country was placed under increased monitoring in February 2020. To this end, I will also share the expectations of the central bank on what needs to be done to ensure that we continue to meet the FATF recommendations and sustain the effectiveness of the reforms undertaken. I will then move on the role which the central bank is playing in the evolving banking and payments landscape and on the upcoming initiatives in this regard. So rest assured, myself and Mr. Dako, we have consulted. We're not going to talk about the same thing, being sister regulators. FATF Grey Listing, our experience at the bank and in the banking community. When a jurisdiction is placed on the Grey List, this means that the jurisdiction has taken a commitment to resolve the identified strategic deficiencies in the AML CFT system by the FATF within an agreed time frame. The FATF does not call for the application of enhanced due diligence to be applied to the jurisdiction, but it encourages its members to take into account the information presented in the FATF statement in their risk analysis. Such listing therefore serves as a signal to the global community that the particular listed country has a higher money laundering and terrorism finance risk profile. Such perception is likely to bring about some adverse impact on a country's banking sector, such as de-risking by correspondent banks becomes a very big issue. The application of enhanced due diligence for the transactions by correspondent banks, which result in delay in payments, impacting supply chains and trade, and increase cross-border transaction cost. And of course, reputational damage, which would adversely affect the country and the financial system by reducing its attractiveness to investors and corporates and causing capital outflows, withdrawal of deposits, and reduced economic performance. During the period when Mauritius was on the Grey List, many correspondent banks followed up closely on the quality of the risk governance framework and the risk management system of our banks to gauge their risk profile before determining whether to maintain, to restrict, or to exit the business relationship. Nevertheless, most correspondent banking relationships, particularly those in the major currencies, they were maintained, and consequently, the execution of cross-border transactions was not hampered significantly. Indeed, the banking sector continued to service its customers, and as a testimony, the GBC deposits increased by 26% as at 30th of June 2021 compared to February 2020. This was despite the pandemic and the listing of the FATF, the EU, and the UK, and confirmed the trust and confidence that market players placed in this jurisdiction. The way forward, the expectations of the central bank. Ladies and gentlemen, it is noteworthy to highlight that Mauritius remained on the FATF Grey List for a relatively shorter period than most countries, as the country completed their FATF action plan well ahead of the timelines set and exited the Grey List in October of this year. This significant and rapid progress to implement the action plan would not have been possible without the strong political commitment taken at the highest level of the state to reform the country's AML safety regime. Much work has been achieved by the bank regarding the level of cooperation between competent authorities and their foreign counterparts. Memorandum of understanding have been drawn up in that respect with the relevant and the competent authorities. Tremendous progress has been achieved today on the technical side, as lovely expatiated by Mr. Taku. And Mauritius today is rated as compliant or largely compliant with 39 out of the 40 FATF recommendations, which is very significant progress from the time of the adoption of the MER, that is the Mutual Evaluation Report in July 2018, when the country was only rated largely compliant or compliant with only 14 out of the 40 FATF deficiencies. At the bank, we have enhanced the Banking Act and issued a new guideline on AML safety as part of our commitment to consolidate the jurisdiction's AML safety regime. The bank will continue to enhance its regulatory and supervisory framework to the highest international standards and will ensure that the banks remain well abreast with the reforms undertaken. The exit of Mauritius from the FATF Grey List will now allow the country to be delisted from the list of high-risk countries of the EU and the UK. As stated by Mr. Taku and Ms. Calcutteea a bit earlier on, We are now faced with the task of repositioning Mauritius as a financial center of international repute, which will have a positive impact on the banking sector growth and the economy at large. We expect investment flows and GBC deposits to pick up. It is therefore key that the sector, be it banks, management companies, or financial market players, they continue to remain vigilant on the associated AML safety risk. New businesses should not be forged just for the sake of increasing our turnover, but we should be applying the highest standards of screening before entering any business relationship. Request for integrity report as part of the due diligence exercise, and monitor as part of our ongoing business relationship to uphold the trust and the confidence placed in our jurisdiction. In this task, the continuous engagement and the collaboration of the private sector is imperative to maintain the highest standard and the continued effectiveness of the AML safety regime. Indeed, the private sector has been and has always been at the front line of the AML safety regime, as they are not only the gatekeepers of the financial system, as stated by Mr. Taku, but sometimes they also act as whistleblowers. To this end, I would like to emphasize on the importance of strong corporate governance and control or assurance frameworks, as well as adequate resources to ensure that the country sustain the effectiveness of the AML safety regime. I will now talk about sound corporate governance. Sound corporate governance is not only a critical ingredient for a financial institution, but is a vital component for a robust financial system. The soundness of financial institutions is largely dependent on their capacity and ability to identify, gauge, monitor, and control the risk they face. And at the level of the Bank of Mauritius, sound governance of financial institutions is on top of our priorities. The Bank of Mauritius expects the Board of Directors to exercise an effective oversight on the affairs of their financial institutions, and that the Board of Directors is well apprised of all the risks that the institutions take, including but not limited to AML CFT. In this respect, we can congratulate the laudable initiative of the National Committee on Corporate Governance, which launched their corporate governance scorecard for Mauritius yesterday, and which is a step in reinforcing the governance structure of the significant financial market players of the country. The roles and the responsibilities of control or assurance functions cannot be overlooked. Now, what do I mean by control and assurance functions? I am referring here to the risk management function, the compliance function, and the internal audit function of a financial institution. They play a key role in assessing the adequacy and effectiveness of the controls and the mitigants in place, and they provide relevant independent assurance to the senior management and the Board of Directors. It is important that these functions are adequately staffed with the requisite expertise and experience, given the evolving nature of the risk environment. I will now come on to capacity building, and I know it's a recurrent feature of this workshop today, but it is an important and undeniable fact that we need to build our capacity building at the bank and in the country. This brings me to this very important aspect to ensure that we have an effective risk management framework in our institutions. we have at the Bank of Mauritius set up a specific unit to look into the AML/CFT regulation and supervision. The staff are continuously trained on various aspects relating to the AML/CFT risk, including current and emerging issues. During the year, we have conducted several outreach programs for the sector and will continue to engage with the industry on this particular area of interest. As announced in the recent budget, together with the Financial Services Commission, we have embarked on a program of recruiting 100 young graduates who will be trained on the various aspects of AML/CFT. They will also benefit from short-term attachment with the industry. We believe that this initiative will contribute in addressing the knowledge gap, and we also urge the industry to come up with capacity building programs for the existing and new recruits to ensure that they remain well versed with all aspects of AML/CFT risk. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now share with you some of the initiatives which the Central Bank has taken and will be taking in view of transforming the banking and the payment landscape. Indeed, changing dynamics in the global and the domestic banking industry over the last decade has ushered in a new era of disruption to the banking business. The growing use of technology and the rising importance of such challenges such as climate change, the advent of digital currencies and alternative forms of payments, they are reshaping the banking landscape. These developments are changing the way people and businesses manage their financial resources. The pace of technological development in the financial sector has only but accelerated with the COVID-19 pandemic. On the other hand, the increase in the regulatory reporting requirements has also spurred development of what we call RegTech, which is regulatory technology, and SupTech, supervisory technology solutions. To this end, both the central bank and financial institutions are now focusing on technological innovations to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of their operation as well as their operational resilience. In order to create an enabling environment, we have at the central bank initiated a number of projects. The digital bank, with a view to encourage further innovation and competition in the banking industry, as well as to contribute in maintaining the jurisdiction's position as an international financial center. The Banking Act 2004 has been amended to allow the Bank of Mauritius to license digital banks. These are banks that will carry on banking business exclusively through a digital platform or electronically. The Bank of Mauritius, we are currently preparing a guideline for digital banks with a view to allow these banks to start operations and grow in a sound and conducive environment. There is also the private banking that Mrs. Calcutteea has just mentioned, and the Bank of Mauritius has already issued a new guideline which is in consultation phase with the industry, and it is on our website, and you are very free and you're welcome to have a look and share your thoughts before we wrap up and finalize this guideline. This guideline will provide more flexibility in terms of seed capital, in terms of percentage shareholding that the shareholders can have, and also on the compliance framework. As you're aware, the complaints that the banking sector, that the regulator always faces, is the compliance framework, the huge compliance cost that is required for the banking industry. And we've tried for the private banking to provide some more flexibility, but without compromising on our standards. To have digital banking and the new innovations, we need digital onboarding. and that is a key element for the digital banking and the digitalization process of the island. The bank is looking into leveraging on two platforms provided by the government, namely the Mocloud platform and the Info Highway platform, to facilitate the digital onboarding process. The Mocloud platform provides access to digital copies of KYC documents such as birth and marriage certificates, while the Info Highway platform provides data on individuals and corporate entities from several government agencies. We'll also, at the bank, be initiating the setting up, together with the FSC, of a FinTech and Innovation Hub and Digital Lab, which will, among others, provide a test environment for FinTech to develop and test their products and services and hence foster innovation. Ladies and gentlemen, while the bank strongly supports innovation, it also expects that the associated risks are duly identified, understood, assessed, and mitigated. Indeed, the ongoing digital transformation of the banking sector, and with the recently adopted concept of work from home, is exposing banks to heightened levels of cyber attacks and technology risk. As people are going cashless and they are opting for online banking services, they are becoming more prone to cyber attacks in the form of malwares, spoofing, and online banking phishing scams, to name just a few. With the threat landscape becoming more and more complex, having adequate controls on the cybersecurity and technology risk has become more important than ever before. I would urge stakeholders to conduct relevant assessment of their technology infrastructure, as well as that of their third-party service providers, and implement relevant controls which are commensurate with the complexity of the risk identified. Contingency plans should also be developed and tested in case of interruption of such business services. Customer education on cyber risk and other threats associated with the use of digital channels also remain crucial. It is important that the less financially literate segment of the population is not left out in this journey. Stakeholders should thus raise awareness of their customers on security measures to be taken, including protection and safekeeping of passwords and other personal information, and the use of digital services. In this connection, I would invite all stakeholders to refer to the scam alerts which are regularly posted on the website of the bank and other regulators. Before concluding, I would now like to raise the question, is there a need for a new banking landscape? Ladies and gentlemen, to reflect the vibrancy of the International Financial Center of Mauritius, the banking industry needs to be at the cutting edge of innovations and continuously meet evolving expectations of domestic and cross-border customers. To this end, the governor of the bank established the Committee on the Future of Banking in Mauritius in July 2020 to address these challenges and opportunities, especially as the banking sector has a pivotal role in the economic development of the country. Membership of this community comprises the governor, the chief executive of the MBA, chief executive officers of a number of banks, and two seasoned financial sector experts. This collaboration between the bank and the MBA, the Mauritius Bankers Association, will culminate in the elaboration of an actionable strategic roadmap for the banking sector for the next 5 years. The consultant, which is world-renowned, Oliver Wyman, is already engaging with the key stakeholders in the financial industry as well as the authorities as part of the information gathering process and diagnostic phase to design the strategic roadmap for the banking sector. Some of you present this morning may have been invited already to share your thoughts, and the abridged version of this report will be published. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have now reached the end of my deliberation this morning and wish you all a very fruitful workshop, and thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you had a lovely tea break. It is with great pleasure that I will now invite Mr. Matthew Purchase, partner within the Bowmans SE team and partner within the Corporate Investigations Practice, to give us an insight of his experience within the area logistics. Matthew, if you would please.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Thank you, Shianee, for the introduction. I must say it's wonderful to be here, having flown in a little bit earlier in the week. I suppose one of the advantages of being a firm like Bowmans is that we get to make these sort of trips, but I had to fight off a number of my colleagues to come to Mauritius, and I know you're probably tired of hearing it, but it's wonderful to be here. It must be and to be with you today. So just to start off, let's say firstly I'd like to thank Bowmans and my colleagues for having me here. I'd also like to just acknowledge my esteemed colleagues who'll be speaking after me, Mr. Samad Jumun from the CEO of Mauritius Finance, and Mrs. Shianee Calcutteea from the Financial Services Commission, as well as the other esteemed guests we have in the audience, and all of you for taking the time to attend our talk this morning. Just a little bit of background around who I am. I'm not a banking regulatory lawyer. I am an investigations lawyer. And the reason what I'll be hoping to talk to you all about this morning, practically, is just to talk a little bit, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction, just talk about the South African context, the contrasts between South Africa and Mauritius in the money laundering space, and some of the trends that we've seen, and then also just talk about enforcement. I think, just to start out, I think it's quite important to note that it's not a case of South Africa, I'm not coming here to talk about best practice in South Africa. In fact, it's quite the reverse. And the comparison that I'll do is more of a contrast. What I hope to show is what's the difference between South Africa and Mauritius, and also because of South Africa's unique position at the moment, and I'll talk a little bit about that. There's been the money laundering system in South Africa has been stress tested to some extent, and we've done a lot of work around that. So I would hope to be able to share some of those learnings that we have around that sort of stress, the stress testing. But as I said, it's wonderful to be at this conference, which is a good news conference, right? About the removal from the list, and just sitting here this morning, I think I've learned as much as I hope that I can impart to you through my talk this morning. So I suppose just talking then a little bit about South Africa and my context and the reason why I'm here. In South Africa, we're quite lucky. We have the opportunity as a firm to work both for the state, for public entities, and for private entities. So I have previously been an inspector of banks, and I hold, as a firm and personally, I hold engagements with our National Prosecuting Authority in order to prosecute crimes including white-collar crime and money laundering. And we also act for a lot of private clients. So I've acted for a lot of banks and a lot of financial institutions. So that's, as I said, South Africa is fairly unique in very many other jurisdictions. That's not the case. If you work for the enforcement authorities, then you're often precluded from working for private. But we do both, and I think it gives us a little bit of a bit of an insight. And as I say, we do a lot of work for the Reserve Bank itself, as well as for private clients. We've also, one of my colleagues who's recently joined us as a consultant is Ian Simpson, and he used to be the General Counsel for Standard Bank. And it's instructive talking to him, because again, within my practice as an investigations lawyer, matters, so when we're talking about money laundering, the predicate offences, the offences that underlie very often fraud and corruption. And of course, Ian Simpson was the General Counsel of Standard Bank at the time that they faced very significant enforcement action in Tanzania under the UK Bribery Act. So it's that sort of context that I would hope to bring. The other context is that's hopefully the good news and why we're here, but I suppose the other context I bring with me is the state capture context in South Africa at the moment. And for those of you who haven't followed it very closely, South Africa for the last number of years has been embroiled in a very significant corruption scandal involving very senior government officials, including the then President Jacob Zuma. Why? You ask why is it relevant to you? It's relevant to you because of this. Those proceedings are, as I say, are very significant. They occupy a huge amount of enforcement time and regulatory time. And there's actually been a commission established, and the commission is run. It's a public commission to testimony by banks, financial institutions, and others before the commission. They've been summoned to explain the extent, and advisors. So professional advisors, including auditors and law firms, have also been before the commission. And what that is, as I said, the importance and the learnings that I have from that is that it's stress tested the money laundering regime. And very many, if you look at the banks and how they've dealt with it, that public process there's some learnings from that, and we'll, I hope to talk through some of those trends. One of them is reputational risk. So apart from a narrow compliance risk that we have in ensuring compliance with money laundering, the other is, as institutions, there's often very significant reputational risk as well as looking after our client relationships. All right, I'm going to, as I say, you'll forgive me, I might jump around a little bit through the slides just to make sure I keep on time. So, on the schedule this morning, I titled my speech a comparison, but and really what I've set out here, and I'll take you through it, it's very hard to make sense of just as it stands there, but as I was working through it, it struck me that a comparison like for like of South African, for example, South African FATF compliance to that of Mauritius is not, I'm not sure it's necessarily instructive. So what I've really done is try to contrast those elements which I think are important. And what I've set out here are the most recent ratings. The darker green the better, and the darker red the worst. And really all it is the top two rows contrast Mauritius against South Africa. And as I say, all the dark green shows where it's compliance, and the orange shows, the red is non-compliant, and the orange then is partially compliant. And as I say, those are, if you count them all, I don't expect you to, I'm not going to talk you through all of those. Those are the 40 recommendations of the FATF. And I suppose, just to address the misconception, this isn't a case of me coming to talk to you about South African best practice. And it's rather a case of showing that South Africa has its own very real challenges. And in fact, in the most recent FATF recommendations, South Africa has been given 18 months, or it will itself be placed on the grey list. So, as I say, it's not lip service. I sat here listening intently and learning as much about that as anything else. The second row of data deals with effectiveness. And I suppose the reason I've pulled it out is that's a really big part of what I want to talk about today. And my observations as an investigations lawyer. And you'll see that both Mauritius and South Africa, if you look at that, the effectiveness ratings is where we fare most poorly, both countries. And as I say, implementation. If I could leave you with takeaways from what I talk about today, it would be that implementation and capacity building, in my personal experience, is very significant and should be a focus area. If one looks at from the top, whether we have an appropriate legislative regime to deal with money laundering, it's clear that with the work that's gone in Mauritius, that you have that regime. And the institutions, as much as we have, and we are developing internal processes and procedures which are compliant and comply with the legislation. That's great. And what I see in practice is, unfortunately, that's where a lot of people stop. And they say, we've got the law, we've got the policies, we've appointed somebody to look after it, we're good. And my practice as an investigation lawyer is ordinarily I'm involved at the end when there's a problem. And what I see recurrently is a lack of implementation. And that's that. So if I could leave you with a thought today, it would be the implementation of not only the crafting of our policies and procedures internally, but the implementation of it through capacity building, through training, through monitoring. That's where it's all falls down. And sometimes establishing policies that are platinum policies with no implementation of is actually creates a risk for yourself, because you set up in your policy procedure what you should be doing, and if you fail to do that. So that's what one can say, is just make sure that we marry those two issues. Right, those are just the recommendations. I'm going to pass through those fairly quickly and just highlight, I'm cognizant of the time, just highlight some of the important themes that I see. When I look at this, the one is the reporting obligations, prohibition against tipping off, and confidentiality. So most or all modern money laundering regimes contain suspicious transaction reporting. Of course, it's a keystone of those policies. Most modern regimes, including South Africa and Mauritius, contain a prohibition against tipping off. And as you all, I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the penalties for tipping off are severe. It's up to a period of imprisonment of up to 10 years. But the issue, and again, on paper, that all seems fairly common sense. We've got a report, we can't tip off, that's all right. And there's also the existence of a confidentiality obligation ordinarily. Certainly in banks, there's a bank-account confidentiality undertaking, but in almost all financial services, there's some duty of confidentiality, contractual, that you would owe your client. On paper, that sounds easy, but in practice, I have spent a lot of time trying to deal with those issues, because when it gets stress tested, it's not as black and white as it appears on paper. So, for example, to give you a real-world example, in South Africa, we had banking clients of ours who were conducting bank accounts and complying with the narrow money laundering obligation. So, in other words, they were reporting cash threshold issues and reporting suspicious transactions when they saw them. But at the same time that was happening, they had, for example, very high-profile press reports on all sorts of other things that impacted the transactions that they could see in the account. And the banks often had to come to us and say, well, we're unsure how to deal with this because we're doing narrow compliance with what we have to. But to some extent, we want to make further disclosures that we owe our own clients a duty. And the fact that something, for example, has been reported in the press doesn't make it so. So it can be difficult, and what we've seen as well, another thing I'll leave you with is the reputational risk that arises from non-compliance or from, and again, material compliance. So in South Africa, a lot of our banks and financial institutions have, it is, if I can say so, a little bit unfair sometimes, but after the fact, they've gone back and they've given testimony, for example, for the Commission. And they've faced very severe criticism for why did you not deal with this? Why didn't you identify these transactions earlier? Why didn't you do more to stop what was obvious? And the amounts are staggering. It's millions and billions of dollars that went through those accounts. And in hindsight, and the public are just critical of how the bank's dealt with it. But you can see it's quite difficult within this framework when you seize, when it's stress tested, when you've got a client. And the other thing not to lose sight of is we all have commercial relationships as institutions and banks with those clients, right? They might be important clients, and you're not entitled, you can't tip them off, but you may have a reservation about them. So what I'm saying is that's quite one of the things we see. One of the trends I just wanted to put out is that interesting, or not, yeah, the interesting and sometimes very difficult relationship between a confidential obligation, your narrow reporting obligations, you're tipping off. In South Africa, and I won't spend much time on it, South Africa, we've got a mandatory reporting obligation, in addition to all of this, for any fraud, theft or corruption involving more than 100,000 rand. That's not a lot of money, particularly not in a dollar or pound matter. So in addition, so it starts getting quite difficult. So as an institution, you may have, apart from your anti-money laundering obligations, you may in addition have another obligation to report the matter to the police. And the issue there is if you don't report it to the police, the individual, it's not a company, the individual who fails to report it is guilty of an offence and can be in prison. So that's an interesting dynamic. The other theme I just wanted to put out that we see a lot of, I have got a team of 5 people who all they do is they do essentially what we call investigative profiling or enhanced diligence. And essentially they're building profiles of people. And ultimate beneficial ownership is a nightmare. It is very difficult to confirm ultimate beneficial ownership. And of course, under the AML regime, ultimate beneficial ownership in terms of your own framework in Mauritius, determining ultimate beneficial ownership is one of the things that needs to happen. And I have seen as well changes to the Companies Act in the central register of ultimate beneficial ownership. But that's what I would expect to see coming forward. What we've seen in other jurisdictions is an increasing focus on that, on how that works, on comply, and again, not just having the legislation that says it, but implementation of that, the extent to which it's actually implemented and given effect to those ultimate beneficial ownership provisions, and also the extent to which access can be given. So I think, and I speak to be corrected, but certainly in South Africa has been criticised for being able to provide that information. And I believe Mauritius, one of the criticisms about Mauritius regime as well was the access to that information for the regulators and otherwise. So that's a clear focus area that one has to look at. And again, in the South African context, we're behind. We're only we proposed amendments to our Companies Act to allow for ultimate beneficial ownership. But interestingly, there is that our regime looks like it's going to provide substantially more access. So it won't be just open to regulators, but that information will actually be more accessible. So that's a real world problem in doing diligence. And as you know, in terms of the AML regime, client due diligence is a big thing. And so again, that will be a focus area, what we expect to be a focus area going forward. The other is reputational risk, and I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm not going to talk much more about that. We have seen, and we've had to advise clients on very clear material reputational risks that arise from how they deal with these matters. And the last one is, on this slide certainly, is capacity building and reinforcing that good governance is good business. And when I said that, I saw some of your eyes glaze over. It's like, but it's the truth. From my perspective, if you have a look at the enforcement action, when I come in at the back, so and we're involved, as I say, both in compliance and at the back, but undoubtedly the matters where we are called in at the end to investigate matters as part of enforcement, so either for the company to deal with enforcement action, to remedy it, or on behalf of regulators. The costs and the management time and the reputational risk associated with that non-compliance. And the problem is it stings because non-compliance doesn't bite you until it bites you. And if it makes any sense, you don't know. It's very difficult unless you have robust internal monitoring systems. You don't know how non-compliant you are until there's an enforcement action or somebody looking into it. And then it bites. One of the things that I did is for MoneyGram, which is, I'm sure you know, is a money remittance business. In 2012, for money laundering issues, so basically failing their KYC obligations. In the US, they entered into a deferred prosecution agreement. The first payment for that was $100 million that they settled in order to try to, and they entered into a monitorship. That monitorship was, there's an individual American lawyer, Aaron Marku, he's in a big firm, Freshfields. He was appointed as the monitor. And it's also, all of those costs, the cost of a monitorship of an American firm reviewing them is borne by the company. So that was in 2012. For 5 years they were monitored. In 2018 it was extended and they agreed to a further payment of $125 million. What I did as part of that, myself and my team, we were part of the African piece of, so we were appointed by the monitor to monitor MoneyGram's compliance with its money laundering obligations and its KYC. So we've got hands-on experience, and literally it goes from the very sophisticated head office matters, policy matters, to the individual branch, what's being done at the branch, the implementation of that. And I mean, I've spent time in like the smallest, I think the smallest branch I went to was in Lilongwe in Malawi, which, you know, was a door and almost nothing else. So, yeah, just to I suppose, to talk about that, and that's why I say governance is good business. Of course one has to be, one has to do it appropriately. But failing to invest in my experience, a very real world experience, the costs of failing to adhere to it are very significant. Yeah, and I'm going to wrap up. I think just looking at the time, I'm going to wrap up here with just some final comments. So just around capacity, I'm a bit of a lifer at Bowmans. I've worked at Bowmans the whole of my professional life. It's actually been interesting to me. Very many of the conversations I've had with you, that very many of yourselves have also spent a long time in the institutions. In South Africa, there is a huge problem in a lack of institutional capacity, particularly within our state bodies. We've had a lot of people leaving and moving between state bodies, and that dramatically reduces the capacity of those bodies, the expertise within those bodies, to effectively deal with money laundering. So that's the one observation around that. And also the investments in capacity, right? Both within your own organisations and within the regulators, to invest in building. You know, I heard this morning about the investment in that capacity, and it was gratifying. You know, it makes my speech sound better, because but that's exactly what we see is the need for that investment. And then the last point, I suppose, just to sort of wrap up from my side, is in the South African context, what we see is there are prosecutions for money laundering, but they're not the significant matters. They are what we call self-laundering. So it's where I steal some money or I commit a fraud, and I myself just quickly launder the money, and I myself get convicted of money laundering. It's not significant matters. What we lack, and I mean, the loss to the in this economy through state capture runs to tens of billions of rand, and none of that, we haven't seen any convictions, and that's the issue. And if you look at the FATF recommendations for South Africa, they pull it up straight away. They say, whatever convictions you guys are getting, whatever enforcement action you've got, is aimed at small guys perpetrating small fraud. The really significant, institutional matters, we're not seeing the convictions there. So that's a focus for South Africa. And again, I think something that would be relevant for Mauritius as well, in driving it forward, is just that observation. I mean, I looked for the most recent conviction for money laundering. I'm almost embarrassed to say the most recent one was a policeman who fraudulently claimed travel experiences for 1,000 rand. He was convicted. And great, he should have been convicted, but it's 1,000 rand versus tens and hundreds of millions of dollars where it's going unpunished. So that's the issue. We need to focus on the right things. And then the last one is, as I say, we have mandates for the National Prosecuting Authority to assist in some criminal matters. Those are hard at the moment, and they're very difficult to progress. There's been, objectively, if one looks at it, there's been little progress in South Africa on that. But on the other hand, what we have seen in South Africa is very significant assets forfeiture proceedings for money laundering offences. So the recovery of funds through through the assets forfeiture process has been significant. Guys, I'm gonna wrap up there. I don't want to speak too much. I am going to be around after to answer questions as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Matthew. This was very insightful indeed. I'm sure we can draw from the experience when time will come. For next one, I would like to invite Mr. Samad Johan, CEO of Mauritius Finance, to please address.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Bowmans, for inviting me to share the experience today. Looking at my time, as with the schedule, I was meant to finish at 11:40, so for 5 minutes. No, I'll try to be quick because a lot has been said already by the different speakers, and we will do the same thing, try to be brief and say exactly what we need and what we've been through. First of all, Matthew, you've mentioned compliance. I think as people said, compliance is expensive, but they need to try the cost of non-compliance. Then they will realize what they need to do. But one thing I need to point out, Matthew, if you people were looking at me while you were doing the presentation of the first slide, is the comparison that you showed with the latest report that was published a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't seen it on the website, as of now we comply with 39 out of 40 recommendation, as was mentioned by the CE of the FSC earlier. So it's all started back, we've been talking about the grey listing, but it's not the grey listing that has been really taking our time as industry players. It all started back in 2018 when the MER report was actually published with 58 recommendations. So following the report, there has been a lot of changes that took place, a lot of requirements. We have seen the major amendments of the regulations for FIAMA 2018, which has been a big change in the industry. But when this was actually published, not everything was clear to everyone interested in the industry. So there has been handbook guidelines, the practice note issued by the FSC later on. But one of the main things that was highlighted in the recommendation of the NER was the National Risk Assessment, which started back in 2017, but wasn't completed until the end of 2019. So following the listing of Mauritius, the 5 deficiencies that was highlighted, one of the main which really affect everybody is a risk-based approach to supervision, especially for the global business sector. So the regulator, anywhere in the world, they can't adopt a risk-based approach unless you have carried out a national risk assessment. Because the risk-based approach was actually being devised by the regulator when we got listed on the FATF list in February 2020. So following which we have seen the work of the regulator started. It was mentioned earlier by C. There has been already a couple of rounds of cycle of inspections. The first cycle included in excess of 350 on-site inspection and more off-site inspection. But what really actually affected the industry was at the same time when the list came out in February, a month later we went into lockdown. So in order to implement all the recommendations and the action plan that was put to us by the FATF team, we had to do all this work, the inspection and the off-site and on-site inspection, while everybody was working from home. But this is where I would like to highlight the collaboration between public and private sector, which is, I think, an example for all of us to follow. And we can actually only build up on what we already started. But the private sector has actually worked very closely with the regulator on that. We had several meetings as an industry to actually share the information, disseminate the information to our members, while at the same time seek the right clarifications that were required when this exercise started. In terms of impact, when Mauritius got listed, the impact on the industry, I think we'll talk about different things. The main one was the blow that we had on the jurisdiction in terms of our image and reputation. I think the day Mauritius got listed, many of the operators here had a sleepless night, clients contacting them from all over the world, don't know what to say, when we're going to get out. It was quite difficult initially. And once you got listed, the pressure on the operators managing the concerns, and it was, because one was almost impossible during that period to get new business from new clients. Existing clients you can still manage. There were also a few of them already in the pipeline where investors, especially for funds, decided not to invest in Mauritius and they had to look for alternatives moving to other jurisdictions. So that was a big issue for operators. And over and above that, you have to also try to see how you can mitigate the risk by keeping existing clients, which are very, very concerned at that point in time. But luckily, we've seen, as mentioned earlier by the second deputy governor, our clients has placed their trust in the jurisdiction with the service they had, and some of them knew what we were already doing, started back in 2018. It was also mentioned that we are actually over-regulated, a lot of compliance work that we're doing compared to our peers. But clients placed their reliance on us, they decided to stay, and they knew at one point in time we will eventually get off of this. But this has paid off. We have seen very little businesses moving out of Mauritius. I'm not sure whether COVID has been on our side as well at the same time, but it has definitely helped us, and this was one of the major concerns that everybody had. Because if clients started moving out of the jurisdiction, we could have another issue for the economy, especially in terms of the reserve with our central bank. Another issue we had in terms of our as an industry that we faced all over here, we talk about capacity building, but when this exercise started for all the on-site inspection, people working from home, the distress that we had on the resources, not only from the regulator perspective, but also from the private sector perspective. And we all knew that we had an issue, it's not only Mauritius, but everywhere in the world, lack of compliance professional with the right skills and experience. Luckily, we as an industry, we work closely with the regulator, and we partnered with FSI, Financial Services Institute, with the support of the FSC, the FIU, and HRDC. Last year, we ran several workshops whereby we trained in excess of 1,000 professionals, which includes 200 plus from the industry. But when we were on the list, based on the deficiencies, we were also the DNFPs, which were considered. As the financial services sector, banking and non-banking, we were already applying some of the rules and regulations in relation to AML. We had some knowledge, we had some people internally who could help. But as far as the DNFPs are concerned, many of them these were new. They never heard about having an MLR rule, what does that mean, what is the compliance framework. This is where we did an exercise alongside with the regulators and FSI where we trained in excess of 700 people across the different subsectors within the DNPPs to ensure at least they have the minimum knowledge and they can only build up from there. In addition to that, we did a capacity building for MLROs. The requirements today is for an MLRO, you need to seek the approval of the regulator. You need to have 5 years experience in the industry or 5 years experience as compliance officer or MLRO to be able to get the approval from the FSC. If you don't have people on the ground, where would you get the 5 years experience? So we did some work on that with the regulator at the same time, and we did a capacity building program for around 100 MLROs, whereby we offered them online training, face-to-face training, alongside with the qualifications, which is recognized internationally through steps in the UK. In terms of on-site inspection, and depending on who and which management company or licensees we're talking about, I knew some of them actually had more than 20 on-site inspection in one cycle. One even had 40 on-site inspection in one cycle. Because those who have been through the process would understand what that means, having to deal with 40 on-site inspection over and above that the off-site inspection at the same time. So if you don't have the resources, it won't be able to do that. But luckily, we were all in it together, industry regulators, and it was at the benefit of the jurisdiction. We all had to work on it. As you say, when you have your back against the wall, you don't have the choice, you have to react. The other issue we had was cost of compliance, which in many cases could not be actually passed on to clients. And many of them were absorbed by management companies. And it was, if you don't do this, clients were actually looking at other alternatives. Because when you look at what's happening elsewhere, whatever we were doing here in certain cases, it was way above what other jurisdictions were doing. And the worst was not only the on-site inspection, it was actually when you start getting the deficiency letters. And those who had the chance to go through the enforcement committee with the sanctions letters, we've seen a lot. We've seen a lot of show cause letters. But I think we need to be realistic. It was a painful exercise for everybody. It was new for all industry, regulators, but at the end of it, it was an important one that we had to go through. And while we went through the exercise, it helped us to understand the expectation of the regulator. I'll give an example. When the FAMLA regulation was actually passed on in 2018, the requirements for BRA, CRA, independent audit. We added for 3 years already in our laws. But when the on-site inspection started 2 years down the line, no one knew exactly what was the requirements. Obviously, we had a handbook that was published in January 2020, and I think earlier this year in March 2021, further clarification has been provided on the independent audit, but everybody did not know exactly what was the expectation from them. But the first cycle of on-site inspection gave everyone an indication, an idea of what was expected from them. And this is where it has been a very enriching exercise, because right now, when the regulator is going to any management company for on-site inspection or any licensee for on-site inspection, I think all the information are in place, the framework is in place, and people know what is expected from them. The clients might be unhappy initially when you're being asked to do this exercise, but as it stands today, I think everybody is on the same page and realize the way we used to do business 20 years ago is not the same. We have to move on. The world is evolving. It's just a matter of time before we get a level playing field. So now that we have been delisted from the FATF list, what next? That's the biggest question. Obviously, the first thing that we have to do is to ensure that we are off the EU list, because don't forget we're still on the EU blacklist as of today. Luckily, the EU has actually confirmed, following the discussion with the government at the outset, that there won't be any top-up requirements following the delisting of the FATF. It's just a matter of following the actual process and make the application for Mauritius to be delisted. I know the discussion ongoing through the right channel, so hopefully at some point in time, at least before the year, Mauritius will be delisted from the EU listing. And we also talk about something very important that everybody's touched on it, is sustainability. So it's not about a one-off exercise. You don't expect that the on-site inspection will be reduced. It was clearly mentioned by the CE earlier. I think, if I remember right, is 400 plus on-site inspection already ongoing, with 2/3 completed already, 700 off-site inspection, and it will just continue like this, because at the end of the day, as a regulator, following the NRA, following the risk-based approach, they have to ensure that it goes through the cycle of all licensees within a time frame of 3 to 4 years. So basically, it's like painting the bridge. By the time you finish, you have to start all over again. So it's not going to stop here. Make sure that you have enough resources. I think everybody's at speed with it now. And also, if we talk about sustainability, is we need to ensure that as a jurisdiction, we are the best in class, and we follow very closely what's happening internationally. I think it was mentioned recently by Marcus Player, the president of FATF himself, when he announced the listing of Mauritius. The discussion around the last plenary was on beneficial ownership. Beneficial ownership, the main issue is, we've seen Pandora papers coming out. I think we were lucky that EU clearly informed us that they won't have any top-up requirements. One of the main differences between EU requirements and FATF does not require a public register of beneficial ownership. Because the requirements for EU is to have a public register of beneficial ownership. And now, today, with the discussion of following the Pandora papers, it was already been discussed at the level of FATF. Today, they're not talking about public register. It is still accessibility to the information by the different agencies. But I think in the direction where we never know what's going to happen in the future. So we need to closely monitor what is happening internationally, adopt the best practices, and we have to maintain that we are the best in class. And the good news is, as mentioned also with regards to 39 out of 40, we are among the very few jurisdictions out there who can achieve a 39 out of 40 on the technical compliance vis-à-vis the 40 recommendation of FATF. The only one that we are not compliant with, I think we're partially compliant, is recommendation 15, virtual assets, and hopefully we will have some amendments or a new bill going out to Parliament before the end of this year. And we are hoping for a re-rating, which will take place hopefully around April next year. If we do get through, Mauritius will be the first country in the world to reach 40 out of 40 technical compliance of the FATF recommendation. So it's not a question of trying to get out of the Grey List, but we've turned it around to become also like a model for others to follow. So we need to ensure that we maintain this standard and turn this into an opportunity today. So now we're coming out of the EU list soon, probably being best in class, but we've already seen opportunities as a result of that with international firms started doing the compliance work out of Mauritius. So that's good news, and I think we need to build on that, and this is where we can turn the challenges into opportunities as a jurisdiction going forward. As I mentioned earlier, one of the major challenges we faced, the impact of being on the list, was reputational damage and image issues. So what we need to do now is to ensure that we have a proper strategy, not only at the government level, the private sector level, and everybody all together speaking the same language to ensure that we can do a proper repair of our reputational damage that has occurred, and also put the right arguments, as I mentioned, where we are today, the resilience of the jurisdiction, how we can bounce back following major setback that we have gone through over the past 18 months. We need to also come up with new services and products. It was already announced by the CE earlier. Some of the products that have been mentioned previously. But I know there's also the VCC, which is a very well capital company, of which hopefully there will be a new bill going to Parliament soon. That will be another new product which is already recognized in other jurisdictions such as Singapore. We know India as well is coming with similar products. But we also need to look into our existing model. We have this model which has served its purpose for the last 3 decades. We're talking about the last 30 years. We've all benefit from it, whether it's the operators, whether it's the government, whether it's the population. So everyone out there has benefited from this model. The question that we need to ask ourselves, is this actually sustainable? This is where we need to have a serious thought about it. There's a lot of discussion happening, but we need to come out concretely with proper implementation plan if we need to make any valuable proposition. So the idea would be a lot of discussion has taken place. We don't know in which direction this will be moving, but as an operator operating both locally and internationally across other jurisdictions, we need to see where is our value proposition and how we need to turn things around. Obviously, we have a blueprint exercise that was carried out 3 years ago. Yet again, we haven't seen much of an implementation from that blueprint exercise. A few things was announced in the budget, but clearly, it's not only about new product services, but we need to consolidate our existing and improving our competitiveness. When it's come to competitiveness, we've been talking about cost of compliance, which is very expensive in Mauritius, but also we need to maybe do a proper benchmarking exercise. We have other jurisdictions. Fund industry is not new only to Mauritius, it's everywhere around the world. So how can others get away with certain things? And how do we need to actually bounce back and rationalize wherever required? If we're talking about reducing our cost of operation and making more improvement in our way of doing business, we can't get away by not adopting technology. The good news, we have seen the FSC1 platform. Hopefully, this can serve its purpose still on the early stage, but those who have used it can give you an idea of what we're talking about. But this platform should actually be the springboard to take us to the next level. So this platform, we can reduce our licensing requirement, time for granting the license. Likewise, why not use a similar platform for what we call the eKYC, and we've been talking about the centralized KYC for the past 5 years. I think if you were to mix global business and domestic clients together, it's never going to work. Maybe this platform can be the right tool to start thinking about the actual centralized KYC for the global business clients. I think one of the major concerns everybody has touched about it, as well earlier, is capacity building. And I think we're not doing enough of that. It's high time that everybody put their mind together and work as an industry with one voice, trying to see what we can do in terms of capacity building. At the moment, we are doing some capacity building exercise across different sectors of the industry. We have currently 120 unemployed graduates, which are currently under placement and training, 1/3 of which are in relation directly to compliance, 2/3 into fund accounting. But every single day, I receive calls from CEOs, directors of MCs who are complaining about staff moving from one organization to another. I think it's not only about compliance. I think the issue of capacity building is across the whole industry. We are embarking onto a career education exercise. We will need the support of everyone. we are coming up with different capacity building programs across the different subsectors of the industry, and we need the support of each and everyone. Because if you want to grow the industry today, starting businesses tomorrow, if you don't have people to carry out the task, you will never be able to achieve anything. So I'm really mindful of time. I won't go any further. I think I will stop here, and I'm sure each one of you here had their own experience over the past 18 months, and will be happy to share that with your colleagues or friends. But for me, I think this is what I've gathered, having been through the exercise the past 18 months. But what we need to take out of it is the collaboration between public and private sector. Everyone mentioned it, and I think for one more time I would say a big thank you to the government, the authorities, FSC, Bank of Mauritius, FIU, ROC, ICAC. I think a lot of other organizations as well has worked closely on that, but not to forget those people, the staff and the technicians behind, who has worked relentlessly, the sleepless night, over the weekend, and not a single holidays over the past 18 months. So I think they deserve a big round of applause for these technicians behind the scene. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. John. If that's indeed very good news that there's no top-up required for us to come up the EU blacklist. I would now like to invite Mrs. Shianee Calcutteea, Senior Manager from the FATF, to share with us the expectations of the regulator.
Okay. 20 years ago, we embarked into this journey of creating the Mauritian IFC. We modernized our laws, and the FSTA then, of 2001, created the Financial Services Regulator Commission as the integrated regulator for financial services and global business. And in the same breath, we created the FIAMNA. We got the FIAMNA enacted, which made money laundering a criminal offense. We had the POTA, making acts of terror a criminal offense. And we had a number of other legislations being enacted to ratify the International Convention on Suppression of Financing of Terrorism and Proliferation of Weapons of Mass Destruction. My point here is obviously not to have a lecture on history. Is basically what we had, we thought we were safe, and we were like, what went wrong? And I think Fazil in his introductory remarks clearly went through it. We were in denial, we were angry, we bargained a lot. And finally, in 2018, it was during our bargaining process, we had the FIAMNA regulation in place. We had it. Here it is. What do you want more? And the acceptance phase really came in 2019. We had the UN Sanction Act being put in place, and then the AML CFT-PF Miscellaneous Protection Act of 2019 and 2020. Those acts are really interesting because of a spectrum of legislations in touch. And this is where really we created a new ecosystem for the euro. The usual suspects were there, FSC. The FSA was amended, the Banking Act was amended, the Interest Rate Act, asset recovery, things that you could expect. But then at some point in time, we also had to acknowledge that legal vehicles, that is the basis of our global business, such as trust foundation companies, were also vulnerable to money laundering and had to be enhanced. We had also the DNLPPs being put into the picture, the jewelers, the gamblers, the law practitioners, But then there is something, there are other legislations that were amended that we would not expect primarily, but you can understand why they were there. The MRA, the Civil Status Act, and the Immigration Act. This created an ecosystem. And it's no more financial services being engaged into TF combined or combined, like dealing with those things. It was the whole jurisdiction being involved into that. The main changes though happened at the FIAMLA level, and the section 17 I think has been extended to match in terms of, now if we take it from an FSC licensing perspective, what used to be in the FSC code became now force of law under the FIAMLA. Things like record keeping, CTT requirement, high-risk jurisdiction, those were concepts under the code. Now it was law. What the amendments also brought was, again, supervisory powers to the supervisors, the registrars, the competent authorities. We were given the powers, those who didn't have the power, and the authority to make things happen at the money laundering level. So, my point also in bringing back down memory lane, if I may say so, is basically that we had it in our DNA. We had the KYC, the simplified due diligence, the transaction monitoring, the STR. Everything was there, but it just needed to be played at another level. And this is what the legislation basically brought. We enhanced our framework. Newcomers were in. If you have seen our figures in terms of cycle 1, business risk assessment and independent audit was the limit of our cycle. In terms of it had the lowest compliance, but we are there. In terms of the handbook being put into place to help into the guidance. So with all this legislation being happening, and we could not, as the regulator, continue to monitor, to supervise the way we did. We moved away from our compliance-based type of supervision, and we entered into a risk-based. Compliance-based, unfortunately, had this bad reputation of being a tick box approach, but in terms of risk-based, it was not easy. I think somebody put it also, in terms of risk-based, it was not easy. It was time-taking, it was challenging. It requires a whole change in the supervisory culture. And most of all, there is no supervisory world if there is nobody to supervise. So the industry also had to cope with that and to make things happen at real level. So a risk-based strategy basically means we work on the nature, the frequency, the intensity of our supervision. I think the CE has been giving you some vertiginous type of number of inspection that we have been conducting during cycle 1 and cycle 2, and it will continue, unfortunately or fortunately. We had also some insight on the FSC1 platform or whatever strategy. When you're talking about risk-based approach, it means that at some point in time the FSC had to put in place a data strategy. We can't evaluate things if we don't hold the information in place. Okay, so this is where you got to have a lot of to submit a lot of questionnaire to the FSC. We started with the self-assessment RPS questionnaire. This helped us to determine your level of risk, bucketing the different FIs within different sectors in risk categorization, low, medium, high, very high, things like that. And we went on in terms of scheduling, be it on-site and off-site. We've been through that. In our previous way of doing things, when we were inspecting FIs, we would ask you to submit, we asked the FIs to submit the information. With the number of inspections that need to be conducted, we had to have it in a structured manner. The inspection evaluation questionnaire was put in place, which helped us collect structured and both unstructured information, and basically gives us a preliminary assessment of who you are. Then we had our on-site visit. This is multi-fold. An on-site visit is not the same thing as an off-site. An on-site visit is a verification process. And it needs to be verified into a standardized way also, to some extent. Obviously there will be some exceptions, but our point also is to be able to compare our findings likes with likes. So we need to have a standardized way of doing things. This has been done by interviewing at board level, and also the staff. We wanted to have this full spectrum of what is it that we do. We had the walkthrough, and this was quite difficult because some of our inspections were conducted during the lockdown period. And with the help of industry, we were able to do it because, at least for the big companies, you had the system on cloud and we were able to do the walkthrough, to run the dummy test. We also do it for sample testing. All those are indicators for us to have a 360 view of who you are and how you are doing. This is all about risk based. It's not about, okay, you've made the CDD, you've done that, you've done that, you've done that. And basically, in this approach, sometimes it's so what. The so what is how are you doing as compared to others? How are you doing as compared to our this industrial sector in which you are operating? Out of it, usually you will get a deficiency letter, or unfortunately for some of you, a show-cause letter, which means that the matter has been referred, and time is being provided to remedy. And usually we'll assess the remedial plan of site, or sometimes we'll go on site. My point in going through this whole process is for you also at your level, now that you know that this process, you know that about that, how do you adjust? How do you organize your operation? How do you fit? Because we know we have been abusive in terms of food inspections, but we had to do it. We had no choice. You had no choice, we had no choice. We had to make it happen. So this is the process. And basically, what we require from you is reciprocating what we are doing at your level in terms of understanding your ML risk. And this is where we have been conducting a lot of outreaches to identify the different type of typologies, to measure your risk, to manage your risk, to recalibrate and to conduct your audit and to start again. So basically, it's all about risk management. We've talked about the National Risk Assessment Program, where we have the different sectors have been conducted, the NRF for the different sectors have been conducted, but it's due, it's due by now. So we are going to conduct another NRF. Some might also talk about the only one that we have, only one recommendation 15 that we have not yet met is basically virtual asset. The National Risk Assessment for Virtual Assets is ongoing. So again, this will impact on your business because you can't deny. This is the whole point of risk assessment, is to understand the inherent vulnerabilities of the sector. It's not about saying, no, I'm not dealing into this part, or no, I'm not exposed to ML. It's about saying that I'm in the sector, I am vulnerable to this particular risk, and now how do I manage this risk? Because this debate of saying that I play golf with my client, I know him. No, it doesn't work anymore. I need to have the CDD. I need to have everything in place. So, this is basically our last point in terms of records. But in the management of risk, this is what the regulator expects, is that you understand from the national perspective where this particular sector sits. We have seen a business risk assessment being conducted, but then not taking in consideration the national risk assessment. this is deemed to evolve, it will evolve because now we have a lot of data. Remember, we have all those questionnaires being sent out and all those information being gathered during our on-site visits. So it will affect our national risk assessment, but as it affects positively, there are more threats coming in. We need to acknowledge that part. Because as we understand more and more our typologies, the crooks out there are finding more and more creative ways of laundering money. So we need to start again in terms of mitigating our risks, etc. So at some point in time, it's a ever-going process. So I tried to find a conclusion to this presentation, and the only thing I saw was like, we need to start again. So Shianee put it down here. It's about the independent audit. It's about being aware of the different amendments, because as things evolve at international level, at domestic level, we need to implement, and then it cascade down into the sector, then it cascade down into the FIs, and this is how things happen. So it will keep on changing. The approach of the FSC changes as things move, because we are in a dynamic sector. It's not a sector it has not stayed rigid for the past 20, 30 years, as somebody put on. It has evolved. It's deemed to evolve, and it will still evolve. And if we want to stay in that game, and I think we've learned it the hard way this one, we have to evolve. Thank you.
Thank you, Shianee. I think this was quite insightful for everybody here, especially in terms of what BFS is expecting from us. This concludes all the intervention of our speakers, so now the floor is open to any questions or comments that you may want to address our esteemed panelists. I don't know if our mics going around or... I think everybody's good. Yeah. We've talked enough. Well, with that said, I would like to invite you for finger lunch, which is being served outside. But happy, to grab any questions or comments on the floor.
Gary has a question.
Gary, go on, Gary.
Just to kick off. So, Samad, you mentioned that there has been a lot of changes that have been happening. I think we have had two budget speeches whereby there was a mention that there would be a centralized database for KYC, which both the BOM and the FSC will be using. How are we on this project, and how is the private sector helping out to ensure that this sort of avoid the duplication of getting documents from an operational perspective?
Thank you for this question, Gary. I think it's not been mentioned twice. It's been mentioned 4 times in the past 5 years on 4 different budgets. But I think there has been some work being done at the level of Bank of Mauritius. And the major challenges that they had was how would you bring the information of domestic clients alongside with the foreigners. Because the domestic clients, you can link their utility bill providers directly with utility service provider, whether it's CE or even SWA. While for the foreigners, how would you have this API to check the information whether it's correct or not? So there has been a lot of debate. There has been also an RFP which was done a couple of years ago by the Bank of Mauritius, but they couldn't go ahead with it. There was another one that they done it, I think, a couple of months ago. This is what I mentioned earlier. We are having some discussion with the FSC. I think it's important, maybe a lot easier for the FSC perspective, the global business perspective, to try and see whether we can make use of the online FSC One platform. Maybe this will be the solution. We are talking with the regulator and probably will find a solution. My concern is if we're talking about an eKYC, we're talking about the going digital, we need to change the fundamentals, the small things. We can't be going eKYC when we are still asking for a certified copy with white ink in today's world. We've been through this painful exercise through COVID pandemic. it's a lot difficult to get this information to be sent across us and the regulator. I think we need to look at the fundamentals and we need to work out closely with the regulator.
Any other comment, question from the floor?
Thank you very much. I think my only question is around the potential threat for the UBO status that's implemented in the EU, partly in Mauritius. The FATF was a statement that seemed to have it, no public information actually available. But do you see that as a major risk going forward? And what impact could that have for the whole industry?
Yeah, I take this from anyone that's picking on anyone's word. I take it. Look, the beneficial ownership information, the BU has always been the requirements of the global business sector for a long time. It's for a virtue. Because if you don't go and identify your BU, the FSC is not going to grant you a license. Likewise, if you're going to open a bank account without the BU, the bank will not open a bank account. So what was lacking in the law was a register of beneficial ownership, which you hide somewhere but not in a formal register. But with the changes in the requirements, now everyone has a register of beneficial ownership information. And really the major concern was basically with the domestic companies. Because domestic companies could incorporate directly with the ROC, but no one is keeping this information handy. But now everything has been submitted to the ROC and the FSC as the regulator, but the requirement today is to allow easy access to this information by competent authorities, which is already the case. If somebody is asking for the information from a regulator perspective, they have this information available, but there's also the facility of exchanging the information between the regulators themselves. But we don't have any requirement as such to have a public register of beneficial ownership. And there are reasons for that, which a lot of people have put forward, countries have put forward. And it's not only Mauritius. I think if you look at it, most IFCs don't put the information in the public domain. Because as someone rightly said, it's not confidential and it's private, none of your business. So depending who you're talking to, everyone has their own views, own idea on that. But I think it will be a matter of time for me personally, at some point in time, it will be the pressure to get a beneficial ownership information in the public domain. And this is where we need to see, I think, once it's become like a level playing field across everywhere, I don't think everybody will have to deal with it. We won't have a choice.
Any other comments? Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you so much for your time and coming today. I hope you enjoyed the session that we had. I'd like to thank